I was 32 years old when I discovered the real reason my mother never let me meet my grandfather. For my entire life, she told me he was a cruel man who abandoned her without a second thought. But when I finally uncovered the truth, I realized she hadn't been protecting me from him. She had been protecting herself from what he knew. And the truth didn't just change how I saw my grandfather, it changed how I saw my mother. For as long as I can remember, my grandfather was a forbidden subject in our home. His name alone could tighten the air in the room. My mother would stiffen, her jaw setting in that quiet, trembling way it did when she was holding back anger she didn't want to explain. If I asked even the simplest question, what was he like? Where does he live? Does he have my eyes? She would respond with the same clipped sentence, he is not someone you need in your life. When I was 6, I drew a family tree for school. I remember carefully printing my mother's name in purple marker, adding my own below hers. When I got to the branch where my grandparents should have been, I hesitated. Mom, I asked softly, what was your daddy's name? She didn't answer right away. She was washing dishes, but her hands stopped moving under the running water. Finally, she turned it off and dried her hands with slow, deliberate motions. You don't need to write him down, she said. Some people don't deserve space on your tree. I erased the blank branch. As a child, I accepted her explanation because children accept the world as it's handed to them. She said he was selfish. She said he left her and her mother when she was young. She said he chose another family. And because I adored my mother, because she had raised me alone with a kind of fierce devotion that felt almost heroic, I believed her without question. She worked 2 jobs when I was little. She missed sleep so I could have ballet lessons. She went without new clothes so I could have braces. She was both soft and unbreakable, and I saw her as someone who had survived something terrible. Whenever she talked about her childhood, her voice would lower and she would describe poverty, disappointment, and loneliness. The unspoken villain in every story was always the same man, my grandfather. He walked away, she would say, and that kind of man doesn't change. When I was 12, I found an old black and white photograph tucked inside one of her books. It showed a young girl, my mother, unmistakably, with long braids and a shy smile. Beside her stood a tall man with gentle eyes and an awkward, protective posture. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, not possessively, but carefully, as if he were afraid of squeezing too tight. I stared at that picture for a long time. He didn't look cruel. He looked proud. When I brought it to her, she snatched it from my hand so quickly it startled me. "Where did you find this?" she demanded. "In your book," I said. "Is that him?" Her face hardened in a way I hadn't seen before. Not sadness, not even anger. Something closer to fear. "I told you," she said quietly. "We don't talk about him." That was the first time I felt it, that small, sharp crack in the story I had been told. But I buried it. Loyalty is a powerful thing when you're a child. Questioning her felt like betrayal. But as I grew older, though, the silence around my grandfather started to feel less like protection and more like a locked door. In high school, when friends talked about visiting their grandparents during holidays, I would laugh along and pretend it didn't matter. But secretly, I wondered what it would be like to have someone older who saw pieces of me in their own reflection. I wondered if he would have told me stories about my mother as a little girl. I wondered if he ever thought about me. When I turned 18, I asked her again. I was legally an adult by then, standing in our kitchen with a kind of boldness that comes from believing you deserve answers. "Mom," I said gently, "I just want to know his name." Her reaction was immediate. "Why?" she shot back. "Why are you so obsessed with someone who never cared about us?" "I'm not obsessed. I feel like half of my history is missing." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. History isn't always something you need to dig up. That was the moment I realized something important. Her resistance wasn't just about anger. It was about control. She wasn't afraid I would get hurt by him. She was afraid I would learn something she didn't want me to know. Still, I let it go. College came, then work, then life moved forward in the way it always does. The questions stayed, but they quieted into a dull ache instead of a sharp one. It wasn't until my mother fell ill last year that everything shifted. She was diagnosed with a condition that required surgery, and suddenly the woman who had always seemed indestructible looked small in her hospital bed. I sat beside her one evening while machines hummed softly around us. Her hand felt fragile in mine. "Is there anything you want me to do? Anyone you want me to call?" Her eyes fluttered open, and for a split second, I thought she might say his name. Instead, she squeezed my hand and said, "Promise me you'll stay away from him." The fact that she said him without explanation told me everything. Even after all these years, he lived in her mind like an unfinished chapter. "Why?" I whispered. She closed her eyes again. "Because he doesn't deserve you." But lying there, pale and vulnerable, she didn't sound convinced. I sat there for a long time with that letter in my hands, reading the first page over and over, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less unsettling. I had always imagined my grandfather as a man who vanished without explanation, someone who chose absence. But this letter wasn't written by a man who had walked away. It was written by someone who had been shut out. His handwriting was steady, careful, almost formal. He asked about my mother's health. He mentioned missing her birthdays. He wrote about driving past the old house sometimes, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. There was no anger in his words, no blame, just a quiet, aching confusion. I opened another letter, this one dated 3 years after the first. "I have respected your silence," it began, "but I don't understand it. If I hurt you, I need to know how. Please tell me what I did so I can try to make it right." My chest tightened. If he had truly abandoned her, why would he be begging for an explanation? I opened more. The pattern was the same. He wrote every year, sometimes twice a year. He mentioned sending gifts that were returned unopened. He wrote about his regret over that day, though he never described it in detail. He said he wished he could explain himself. And then, about 10 letters in, I found something that made my breath catch completely. "I heard you have a daughter. I don't know her name. I don't know her face. But if she is anything like you were at that age, she must be extraordinary. Please tell her that her grandfather thinks about her every day." My vision blurred. He had known about me. He had wanted to know me. And my mother had decided he never would. I leaned back against the wall, feeling as though the floor beneath my life had shifted. All those years I defended her story. All those times I repeated it to friends, to boyfriends, to myself. My grandfather was a bad man. He left. He didn't care. But these letters painted a different picture. Not of a perfect man, not of someone flawless, but of someone trying, someone reaching, someone who had been refused. And then I found the letter that changed everything. It was dated the year I turned 5. The envelope had been opened, but the letter inside was folded more tightly than the others, as if it had been crumpled once before being smoothed back out. "My dearest Anna," it began, my mother's name. "I know you've chosen to believe your mother's version of events. I understand that you were young and that you trusted her, but I cannot continue carrying a blame that isn't mine. I did not leave you. I left her, and I left because staying meant living inside a lie I could no longer support." I stared at that sentence until it felt etched into my mind. I did not leave you. I left her. My grandmother had died before I was born. My mother rarely spoke of her, except to describe her as strong and misunderstood. I knew she and my grandfather had divorced when my mother was small, but I had always assumed it was because he was unfaithful or irresponsible. That's what my mother implied. But this letter suggested something else entirely. He went on to write that he had tried to maintain visitation, that he had gone to court to secure weekends with his daughter. He claimed that my grandmother had accused him of things that were never proven. that the accusations had followed him into his workplace, into his church, into his friendships. "I will not detail those accusations here," he wrote. "You were too young to understand, and I will not burden you with adult conflicts. But you deserved stability, and your mother and I could not coexist without destroying each other. I fought for you. I never stopped fighting for you." My hands trembled so badly, I had to set the letter down. My entire childhood had been shaped by a single narrative. He abandoned us. But what if the story was more complicated? What if my mother had grown up believing something that wasn't true? Or worse, what if she had known it wasn't true and chosen it anyway? A memory surfaced suddenly. I was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table while my mother spoke on the phone in the other room. Her voice was sharp, almost panicked. "Stop calling here," she had hissed. "You have no right." At the time, I assumed she was arguing with a bill collector or an old acquaintance. But now, I wondered, had that been him? I kept reading. In one of the later letters, he wrote about driving to my high school graduation and sitting in the back of the auditorium, unsure if he should approach us. "I didn't. I didn't want to upset you, but I saw her walk across that stage. She looks like you did when you were 18. She carries her shoulders the same way." I pressed my mouth to keep from sobbing. He had been there, watching from a distance, and I never knew. A strange mixture of grief and anger swelled inside me. Grief for the years lost, anger at my mother for deciding on my behalf. She had always said she wanted to protect me. Protect me from what? From a man who sent birthday cards I never received? From a grandfather who sat quietly in the back of my graduation, afraid to disrupt a story he hadn't been allowed to correct? I gathered the letters into my lap, stacking them carefully. There were so many years represented there, so many attempts. And at the bottom of the box, beneath the letters, there was something else. A small envelope with my name written on it. Not in my mother's handwriting, in his. My hands froze. The envelope was unopened. The paper felt newer than the others. The postmark was only 2 years old. He was still writing, even now, even after decades of silence. I turned it over slowly. The seal was intact. For a moment, I felt as though I was standing at the edge of something irreversible. Opening this letter meant crossing a line my mother had drawn my entire life. It meant acknowledging that her version of the past might not be the only one. It meant choosing curiosity over loyalty. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I slid my finger carefully under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Dear Lily," it read, my name written in full. "If you are reading this, then somehow the truth has found you. I have wanted to meet you since the day I learned you existed. I do not know what you have been told about me, but I pray you will one day allow me to tell my side. I am not a perfect man. I have made mistakes, but abandoning my daughter was never one of them." The words blurred through my tears. At the bottom of the page was a phone number and an address. He was still alive, still waiting. I looked around my mother's bedroom, the familiar dresser, the framed photos of just the two of us, the carefully curated world she had built that excluded one entire branch of our family tree. And for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of a choice that was entirely mine. I could close the box, put the letters back, and continue living inside the version of the past I had always known, or I could step outside it. I wiped my face and picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over the numbers written at the bottom of the page. For 32 years, this man had been a ghost, a villain, a shadow. But now he was real, and he was only one call away. I didn't know what I would say yet. I didn't know what I believed, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I could no longer pretend I didn't want to know.
My thumb hovered over the call button for what felt like an eternity. I kept hearing my mother's voice in my head. "He doesn't deserve you. Stay away from him. Some people don't deserve space on your tree." But then I looked down at the letter again. If you are reading this, then somehow the truth has found you. That line wouldn't let me go. Truth. Not revenge, not justification, just truth. My hands were shaking when I finally pressed the numbers into my phone. I almost hung up before it rang, but then it did. Once, twice, 3 times, and then a voice answered. "Hello?" It was deeper than I expected, older, a little rough around the edges, like someone who had spent years talking less than he wanted to. I froze. My throat closed. I hadn't prepared anything to say. "Hello?" he repeated, softer this time. I swallowed hard. "Is this Daniel?" There was a pause on the other end, a sharp intake of breath. "Yes," he said carefully. "Who is this?" I could have hung up then. I could have pretended it was the wrong number, but something steadied inside me. "My name's Lily," I said. I think I'm your granddaughter." Silence. Not the empty kind, the kind that carries emotion too heavy for words. I thought the call had dropped. "Sir?" I whispered. When he finally spoke, his voice was trembling. "Lily," he repeated, as if testing how it felt to say my name. "You sound just like I imagined." That broke something open in me. I had imagined him as indifferent, maybe even cruel, but this man sounded overwhelmed. "I've found your letters," I said quickly, afraid that if I paused too long I'd lose my nerve. "The ones you sent to my mom." Another pause. "She kept them?" he asked quietly. "Yes." His exhale carried something like relief and pain tangled together. "I always wondered if she threw them away." We talked awkwardly at first, small things, where he lived, how long he'd been there. He told me he'd retired from teaching history 10 years ago, that he still lived in the same small house he moved into after the divorce. He asked about my job, my interests. He didn't pry, he didn't accuse, he just listened. After a few minutes, I gathered the courage to ask the question that had lived in my chest my entire life. "Why did you leave her?" The line went quiet again, but this silence felt different, measured. "I didn't leave her," he said gently. "I left her mother." I closed my eyes. Hearing him say it out loud made it more real. "What does that mean?" I asked. He didn't rush his answer. "Your grandmother was a complicated woman, brilliant, charismatic, but she needed control. She needed every story to bend in her favor." I felt a strange chill at those words. Control, that word again. "We fought, not about money, not about love, about truth. She told people things about me that weren't accurate, things that made me look unstable, unfaithful, dangerous." My stomach tightened. "Dangerous?" I whispered. "Yes," he said softly. "She implied I wasn't safe to be around, especially around Anna." My heart pounded. That was the first time he said my mother's name, not bitterly, just sadly. "That's not what I was told," I murmured. "I know," he replied. "I went to court for visitation. I showed up every weekend I was allowed. But over time, Anna stopped wanting to come. She was young. She believed her mother. Why wouldn't she?" His voice cracked slightly. "Children believe the parent who stays." The words landed heavily. Children believe the parent who stays. That had been me. I believed my mother because she was there, because she sacrificed, because she loved me fiercely. "Did you ever—" I hesitated. "Did you ever do anything that would make her afraid of you?" The question felt disloyal to both of them, but I needed to ask it. "No," he said firmly, not defensive, just certain. I was not perfect. I worked long hours, I argued, I lost my temper in words sometimes, but I never harmed her, not physically, not emotionally in the way she claims. My stomach tightened. Dangerous? I whispered. Yes, he said softly. She implied I wasn't safe to be around, especially around Anna. My heart pounded. That was the first time he said my mother's name, not bitterly, just sadly. That's not what I was told, I murmured. I know, he replied. I went to court for visitation. I showed up every weekend I was allowed. But over time, Anna stopped wanting to come. She was young. She believed her mother. Why wouldn't she? His voice cracked slightly. Children believe the parent who stays. The words landed heavily. Children believe the parent who stays. That had been me. I believed my mother because she was there, because she sacrificed, because she loved me fiercely. Did you ever, I hesitated, did you ever do anything that would make her afraid of you? The question felt disloyal to both of them, but I needed to ask it. No, he said firmly, not defensive, just certain. I was not perfect. I worked long hours, I argued, I lost my temper in words sometimes, but I never harmed her, not physically, not emotionally in the way she claims. My stomach tightened. Dangerous? I whispered. Yes, he said softly. She implied I wasn't safe to be around, especially around Anna. My heart pounded. That was the first time he said my mother's name, not bitterly, just sadly. That's not what I was told, I murmured. I know, he replied. I went to court for visitation. I showed up every weekend I was allowed. But over time, Anna stopped wanting to come. She was young. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my childhood bedroom staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle around me, replaying every word of that phone call in my mind. My grandfather's voice hadn't sounded manipulative. It hadn't sounded rehearsed. It had sounded tired, honest. But honesty is complicated when it arrives after 32 years of silence. I kept thinking about my mother in her hospital bed, pale and fragile, asking me to promise I would stay away from him. She had looked afraid, not angry, afraid. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened between them had left a wound that never properly healed. The next morning, I brought the metal box of letters back to the hospital. I told myself I wasn't going to confront her. I just wanted to see her face when she realized I knew. She was sitting up in bed when I walked in, flipping through a magazine she clearly wasn't reading. She smiled when she saw me, and for a brief second I felt like a terrible daughter. "You're here early," she said softly. I set my purse down and pulled the box out carefully. Her smile disappeared. She recognized it instantly. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice tight. "In your closet," I replied. I placed it gently on the tray table in front of her. I opened them. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. She didn't touch the box. She just stared at it as if it might explode. "You had no right," she said quietly. "I think I did," I answered, my voice shaking despite my effort to stay calm. "They're about me, too." Her jaw clenched. "He's manipulating you." "By writing letters you never answered?" I shot back before I could stop myself. Her eyes flashed. "You don't know what he did." "Then tell me," I said, my voice breaking, "because the story I grew up with doesn't match what I just read." Silence stretched between us. Machines beeped steadily in the background, a cruel reminder of her vulnerability. She looked older than she ever had, smaller. "He left," she said finally. "He left us with nothing." "He says he left Grandma," I replied carefully, "not you." Her hands gripped the hospital blanket. "That's what he would say." "Mom," I whispered, "did he hurt you?" The question hung in the air like glass about to shatter. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her eyes filled with tears. "He hurt me by leaving," she said. "He hurt me by choosing himself over our family." "But did he ever harm you?" I pressed gently. "Physically?" She hesitated just for a second. "No," she admitted, "not like that." That admission felt seismic because all my life the way she spoke about him had implied something darker, something dangerous. "Then why did you tell me he wasn't safe?" I asked. "Because he wasn't safe for me," she snapped. "He challenged everything. He questioned your grandmother constantly. He wanted control." I felt my heart drop. Grandpa said Grandma needed control. Her head jerked up at that. "You spoke to him?" The hurt in her voice cut deep. "Yes," I said quietly. "I called him." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "After everything I've done for you." Guilt flooded me immediately. "This isn't about what you've done for me," I said quickly. "You've been an incredible mother. You've sacrificed everything, but that doesn't mean the past is exactly how you remember it." She stared at me as if I had slapped her. "So you believe him?" "I don't know what I believe," I admitted. "That's the problem. I've only ever heard one side." She looked away, her shoulders trembling. For the first time in my life, I saw not my strong, unbreakable mother, but a little girl who had once stood between two fighting parents. "My mother told me he was unstable. She said he would ruin us. She said he cared more about being right than being a father." "And did you ever see that yourself?" I asked softly. She didn't answer. That silence spoke louder than anything else. "He came to my graduation," I said gently. Her head snapped back toward me. "What?" "He sat in the back. He didn't approach us." Her face went pale. "He told you that?" "Yes." She looked shaken. "I didn't know. I thought he stopped trying." I opened one of the letters and handed it to her. "He never stopped." She took it with trembling hands. As she read, her expression shifted. Anger, confusion, something that looked almost like regret. "He always wrote like this," she said quietly, "like he was the reasonable one." "Maybe sometimes he was," I replied gently. She looked up at me then, and I saw something crack behind her eyes. "You don't understand what it was like growing up in that house," she said. "My mother would cry for hours. She would tell me he was destroying us, that he was selfish, that if I loved her, I would stand by her." My chest tightened. If I loved her, I would stand by her. The same loyalty that kept me from questioning the story. "You were a child," I said softly. "You believed the parent who stayed." The words landed between us, heavy and undeniable. Tears rolled down her face. "I chose her," she whispered. "And after a while, it was easier to keep choosing her than to admit I might have been wrong." I reached her hand. "Mom, did you ever wonder?" She closed her eyes. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but wondering felt like betrayal." I squeezed her fingers gently. "I'm not trying to betray you." She looked at me raw and vulnerable. "Are you going to meet him?" The question was quiet, not demanding, just afraid. I took a slow breath. "I think I need to." Tears slid silently down her temples. "If you do," she said, "I don't know what that means for us." And there it was, the real fear. Not that he would hurt me. 3 days later, I stood in front of a small blue house with white shutters, my hands trembling against the steering wheel. The address from the letter matched the numbers nailed beside the front door. The paint was slightly chipped. The garden looked tended but modest. Roses pruned carefully, a narrow walkway swept clean. Nothing about the place felt threatening. Nothing about it felt dramatic, and somehow that made my heart race even more. This was not the home of a villain from a childhood story. This was just a house. I turned off the engine and sat there, staring at the front porch. I almost drove away twice. Each time I heard my mother's voice in my head. Stay away from him. He doesn't deserve you. But then I heard something else, too. My grandfather's voice, soft and careful on the phone. If you want to meet me, my door is open. I stepped out of the car before I could change my mind again. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked up the path. My hand hovered over the doorbell for a second longer than necessary. Then I pressed it. Footsteps approached slowly from inside. The door opened, and there he was. Older than the photograph I'd seen, his hair almost completely gray now, his face lined deeply around the eyes. But the eyes themselves were unmistakable, the same gentle, searching look from that black and white picture. We just stood there, staring at each other. "Lily," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Hearing my name spoken in person by him sent a strange wave through me, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. "Hi," I managed. For a second, I thought he might reach out to hug me, but he didn't. He stepped back instead. "Please, come in." The house smelled faintly of old books and coffee. The living room walls were lined with shelves filled with history texts and photo albums. On the mantel above the fireplace, I saw framed photographs, some of my mother as a child. My breath caught. She looked happy in them, sitting on his shoulders, laughing at something off camera, blowing out birthday candles. "I kept what I was allowed to keep," he said quietly, noticing my gaze. We sat across from each other on a worn but comfortable couch. For a few moments, neither of us knew how to begin. This wasn't just a meeting, it was the unraveling of 32 years. "You look like her," he said gently, "but you have your own way of holding yourself, stronger somehow." I smiled faintly. "She raised me that way." He nodded, and I saw pride in his expression. Not resentment, not jealousy, pride. "She always was strong," he murmured, "even as a little girl." I didn't want to waste time with surface-level conversation. I needed clarity. "I asked her if you ever hurt her," I said carefully. "She said no, not physically." He closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself. "I never laid a hand on her," he said firmly. "I would never." "Then what happened?" I asked. He leaned back, folding his hands together. "Your grandmother and I married young. Too young. She was brilliant, but deeply insecure. She believed love meant possession. I believed love meant partnership." He sighed. "We fought constantly about small things that were really big things: control, autonomy, reputation." He stood up suddenly and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a thin folder. He brought it back and handed it to me. Inside were copies of old court documents, custody agreements, visitation schedules, notes from mediation sessions. "I fought to stay in Anna's life, but your grandmother painted a picture of me that wasn't accurate. She implied instability, emotional volatility." My stomach tightened. "Were you volatile?" I asked honestly. He didn't flinch. "I had a temper when pushed," he admitted. "I argued loudly. I refused to back down in debates, but I was never violent." He met my eyes directly. "There's a difference." I flipped through the documents slowly. The language was clinical, detached, but it confirmed one thing clearly. He hadn't disappeared. He had pursued visitation legally for years. "Why didn't you show these to my mom?" I asked. "I tried," he replied softly. "But when a child grows up hearing one version of events, documents don't feel as powerful as emotion." That hit hard. Emotion over evidence, loyalty over nuance. I looked up at him. "She said it felt like betrayal to question her mother." He nodded sadly. "And now it probably feels like betrayal to question her own story." We sat in silence for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me. "I don't blame her." I frowned. "You don't?" "No," he said gently. "She was a child in the middle of adult conflict. It's easier to simplify pain into heroes and villains." His words were calm. No bitterness, just acceptance. I thought about my mother's face in the hospital, the way she looked when I told her I had spoken to him. Not furious, not outraged, just shaken. "She's scared," I said quietly. "Of what?" "Of losing me," I admitted. He leaned forward slightly. "Lily, nothing about meeting me requires you to lose her." I swallowed. "But it changes things." "Truth often does," he replied. His living room felt warm, steady, nothing like the storm I'd imagined. He stood and walked towards a small desk in the corner. From a drawer, he pulled out something wrapped carefully in tissue paper. "I've kept this for years," he said, handing it to me. I unfolded the paper slowly. Inside was a small silver. I didn't go straight back to the hospital after leaving his house. I drove aimlessly for almost an hour, the silver bracelet resting on the passenger seat beside me like something alive. Every time I glanced at it, I felt the weight of what it represented. Not just my mother's childhood, not just my grandfather's hope. It represented a choice, a bridge that had never been rebuilt, and somehow I was standing in the middle of it. When I finally parked outside the hospital, my hands were steady in a way they hadn't been before. Not because I felt certain, but because I understood something clearly now. Silence had protected no one. It had only prolonged the pain. My mother was awake when I entered her room. She looked tired but alert. Her eyes immediately dropped to my face, searching. "You saw him," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice yet. She looked toward the window again, bracing herself. "Was he everything you hoped?" she asked quietly. There was something fragile in her tone. I pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down. "He was human," I said gently. "Not a monster, not a hero, just human." Her jaw tightened. "That's how he's always been." Convincing. I took a slow breath and reached into my purse. "He gave me something," I said softly. I placed the bracelet on her tray table. The moment her eyes landed on it, all the air seemed to leave her body. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. "I thought this was gone," she whispered. "He kept it," I said. "All these years." Tears spilled down her cheeks silently. She traced the small engraved pattern with her thumb. "I made him promise he'd never throw it away," she murmured. "I was 8. The room felt suspended in time. "He wanted to give it to you himself," I said carefully. She closed her eyes. "Of course he did." I watched her face closely. Not for anger, for truth. "Mom," I said gently, "why didn't you ever tell me he fought for visitation?" Her eyes opened slowly. "Because it didn't matter in the end," she replied. "He still left." "He left Grandma," I said softly. "Not you." She shook her head. "When a father leaves the house, he leaves the child too. That's how it feels." I nodded. I understood that. Emotion doesn't always align with fact. But feeling left and being abandoned aren't always the same thing, I said. She didn't respond. Instead, she stared at the bracelet in her hand, like it held answers she didn't want to read. After a long silence, she whispered, "Did he show you the court papers?" I hesitated. "Yes." A tear slid down her temple. "I hated those papers," she said. "They made everything official, cold, like I was something to be scheduled." Her voice cracked. "I didn't want to be divided." My heart softened. For the first time, I saw her not as the gatekeeper of a narrative, but as a child who felt pulled apart. "Grandma told you he was unstable," I said gently. She nodded. "She said he would ruin us. She said he cared more about winning arguments than loving us." "Did you believe that?" I asked. She hesitated. "At first, yes. Then, I don't know. Over time, it became easier to believe it than to question it." I leaned closer. "He never stopped writing." Her lips trembled. "I know. That surprised me." "You read them?" I asked. She nodded slowly.
Most of them. Then why didn't you answer? Her eyes filled with something that looked like shame. Because if I answered, I would have to admit I wasn't completely sure anymore. The honesty in that moment hit me harder than anything else. So you chose silence, I whispered. She nodded again. Silence felt safer. I swallowed. Safer for who? The question lingered between us. She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, for me. There it was. Not protection of me, protection of herself, of the version of her childhood that made sense, of the loyalty she had sworn to her mother. I wasn't trying to hurt you, she added quickly. I thought I was protecting you from confusion, from conflict. But the confusion was already there, I said gently. I just didn't have the words for it. She looked at me then, really looked at me. Do you hate me? She asked quietly. The vulnerability in her voice broke my heart. No, I said immediately. I don't hate you. I love you. I reached for her hand. But I can't pretend this didn't shape my life. Tears streamed freely down her face now. I was afraid if you met him, you'd see something in him you didn't see in me. That stunned me. What? I whispered. Strength, she said. Conviction. The parts of him I inherited. I spent my whole life trying not to become him. I squeezed her hand gently. Mom, you are not him. And you are not Grandma either. You're you. She let out a shaky breath. I don't know who that is without the story I've told myself. I sat with that. Because that was the real unraveling. Not just facts about the past. Identity. He wants to see you, I said carefully. Her body stiffened. I don't know if I can. You don't have to decide today, I replied. But the door is open. She stared at the bracelet again. Does he hate me? I asked. No, I said honestly. He doesn't. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she looked like the little girl from the photographs on his mantel, caught between two worlds. I need time, she whispered. Take it, I said. I kissed her forehead gently before standing up. As I walked toward the door, she called my name. I turned back. Thank you for not choosing sides, she said softly. I gave her a small, sad smile. I'm choosing truth. And as I stepped into the hallway, I realized something had shifted. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but the silence that had defined our family for decades was finally cracking. And sometimes healing doesn't begin with forgiveness. It begins with the courage to look at what really happened.
The days after that conversation felt suspended in something fragile and unfinished. My mother was discharged from the hospital, and I brought her home, helping her settle back into the quiet rhythm of the house that had held so many unspoken things. She moved more slowly now, not just because of the surgery, but because something inside her had shifted. The certainty she once carried like armor was gone. In its place was something softer, more uncertain. I didn't mention my grandfather again for several days. I let her rest. I let the silence exist without forcing it into another confrontation. But silence felt different now. It wasn't locked. It was thinking. One afternoon, as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, she spoke without turning toward me. What does he look like now? The question was quiet, almost casual, but I could hear the weight behind it. I dried my hands slowly before answering. Older, I said gently, tired in some ways, but kind. His eyes haven't changed. She swallowed. Does he still argue the way he used to? I almost smiled. He speaks carefully now, like he's afraid of pushing too hard. That seemed to land somewhere deep inside her. She nodded faintly and returned to stirring her tea, though she wasn't really drinking it. A few nights later, I found her sitting at the dining table with the metal box of letters open in front of her. She hadn't known I was awake. I stood in the hallway and watched quietly as she unfolded one after another, reading them with a face that held grief and recognition at the same time. She wasn't angry. She looked sad. When she noticed me, she didn't close the box. She didn't hide it. I remember the day he wrote this one, she said softly, holding up a letter dated 20 years ago. It was my birthday. Her voice cracked. I read it and told myself he was trying to make me feel guilty. She looked up at me. Now I don't know. I walked over and sat beside her. "It's okay not to know," I said. She gave a weak laugh. "I've built my entire life on knowing." That was true. My mother had always been decisive, certain, controlled, and now the foundation of that certainty was trembling. "He never stopped loving you," I said gently. She pressed her lips together, fighting tears. "That's what scares me," she admitted. I reached for her hand. "Why?" She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw something I had never seen before: regret. Because if he loved me all along, then I wasted so many years being angry at the wrong thing. The honesty in that statement took my breath away. "You were protecting yourself," I said. "Maybe," she whispered. "Or maybe I was protecting a promise I made to my mother." The next morning, she surprised me. "Call him," she said quietly while sitting at the breakfast table. I looked up sharply. "What?" "Call him," she repeated. "Put him on speaker." My heart began to pound. I didn't argue. I picked up my phone and dialed the number that now felt less foreign. It rang twice. "Hello?" he answered. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's Lily." "Lily," he said warmly. Then he paused. "Is everything all right?" I glanced at my mother. She was gripping the edge of the table, knuckles pale. "You're on speaker," I said carefully. "Mom is here." Silence fell over the line. Not shocked, not panicked, just heavy. "Anna?" he said softly. My mother's breath hitched. I had never heard him say her name in her presence before. "Hello, Daniel," she replied. Her voice was thin but steady. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just two people standing at the edge of something that had been frozen for decades. "I wasn't sure I'd ever hear your voice again," he said gently. She swallowed. "I wasn't sure I wanted you to." He didn't react defensively. "That's fair," he said quietly. She closed her eyes. I read the letters again. There was a long pause. "I meant every word," he replied. "I know," she whispered. The air in the room felt electric. I stayed silent, barely breathing. "Why didn't you fight harder?" she asked suddenly. The question sounded less accusatory than wounded. He took a slow breath. "Because every time I pushed, it hurt you more. I thought giving you space might one day feel safer than forcing my way in." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I thought you stopped caring." His voice broke for the first time. "I never stopped." That sentence seemed to echo through the kitchen. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, trying to steady herself. "I was angry," she admitted. "I was loyal to her." "I know," he said softly. "She was your mother." The simplicity of that acknowledgement carried no blame, just understanding. "I don't know how to undo 30 years. You don't have to undo them. We can just start with today." My chest tightened. That was it. Not rewriting history, not winning arguments, just beginning where they stood. There was a long silence after that. Then my mother said something I never thought I would hear. Would you be willing to come by this weekend?" I felt tears spring to my own eyes. On the other end of the line, I heard him inhale sharply. "Yes," he said. "Of course." When the call ended, my mother leaned back in her chair, looking exhausted but lighter. "I don't know what this will be," she admitted. "It doesn't have to be perfect," I said. She looked at me with a softness that felt new. "You were right," she said quietly. Silence wasn't protecting anyone. I squeezed her hand gently. Truth doesn't erase love. It just makes room for more of it. And as we sat there in the quiet kitchen, I realized something profound. This wasn't about proving who had been right. It wasn't about rewriting childhood or undoing pain. It was about allowing complexity where there had only been blame, about choosing connection over certainty. That weekend would not erase decades, but it would begin something. And sometimes beginnings are the bravest thing a family can choose. The morning he was supposed to come over, the house felt different. Not tense exactly, but aware, as if the walls themselves understood that something long avoided was about to walk through the front door. My mother had been up since dawn. She insisted on tidying the living room, even though she still tired easily. I watched her straighten picture frames that didn't need straightening, wipe down surfaces that were already clean. It wasn't about cleanliness, it was about control, old habits returning in moments of uncertainty. "You don't have to make this perfect," I told her gently. She paused, cloth in hand, and gave me a faint smile. "I know. I just don't know how to do this any other way." At exactly 11 o'clock, the doorbell rang. The sound felt louder than usual. My mother froze. For a split second, I thought she might change her mind, but then she set the cloth down and walked toward the door. I stayed a few steps behind her, close enough to feel present, but far enough to let this be theirs. She opened the door slowly. He stood there just as I had seen him days earlier, gray hair neatly combed, shoulders slightly hunched, not from meekness, but from humility. In his hands was a small paper bag. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. 30 years of silence standing face to face. "Hello, Anna," he said softly. My mother's fingers tightened slightly on the doorframe. "Hi," she replied. Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. He held up the bag awkwardly. "I brought those lemon cookies you used to like. I wasn't sure if you still—" His voice faltered. My mother let out a shaky breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "I do," she said. "I still do." That small, ordinary exchange broke something open. She stepped aside. "You can come in." He entered slowly, looking around the house with careful eyes, not judging, just absorbing. I saw his gaze linger on the photographs of me lining the hallway. There was pride there, and something like grief. We sat in the living room, the three of us forming a quiet triangle of history. For a few minutes, the conversation stayed safe. Health updates, weather, retirement. But eventually, the air shifted. My mother looked at him directly. "Why didn't you ever tell me about the court documents when I was older?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "Because I didn't want you to feel like evidence," he said gently. "You weren't a case to win. You were my daughter." Her lips trembled. "I thought you cared more about proving Grandma wrong than about keeping us together." He shook his head slowly. "I cared about both, but I didn't know how to fight without making you feel like the battlefield." Silence settled over us, not hostile, just heavy with truth. My mother stared down at her hands. "She told me you would ruin everything," she whispered. "She said you were selfish." He nodded once. "I know." "Were you?" she asked. It wasn't accusatory, it was sincere. He took a long breath before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I was stubborn. I believed being right mattered too much. I didn't always soften my words when I should have." He looked at her carefully. "But I never stopped loving you." Tears slipped down her cheeks freely now. "I built my whole identity around being the strong one, the one who survived abandonment." His voice was steady but tender. "You were strong. You are strong. But strength doesn't require a villain." That sentence seemed to land somewhere deep inside her. I watched my mother's shoulders drop slightly, as if she were setting down a weight she had carried for decades. "I don't know how to forgive something I don't fully understand anymore," she admitted. "Then don't start with forgiveness. Start with understanding." They talked for hours, Not arguing, not rehashing every detail, just filling in gaps. He explained moments she had misunderstood. She admitted times she had refused to listen. There were tears, there were pauses, but there was no shouting. At one point, my mother stood up and walked to the hallway. She returned, holding the silver bracelet. She held it out to him. "You kept your promise," she said quietly. He looked at it, then at her. "I did." She closed his fingers gently around it. "You can give it to Lily," she said. "It belongs to the next generation now." My throat tightened. He turned to me, eyes shining, and placed the bracelet in my hand. "Let it remind you," he said softly.